Good afternoon and good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us at our first Tech Talk. So, we have a series of these sessions where we will be able to connect with innovators and ideators from around the region whose impressive ideas have impacted the world in many different ways. So, what we hope to gain from this session is for us to feel inspired and also to take action. Something that I will note early on in this session is that there will not be a Q&A session, but Hazem has agreed graciously to join us in the breakout rooms afterwards, where he can talk to you one-on-one and address any of the questions you might have about his idea and what he's been working on. So, without further ado, Hazem is a partner and transportation consultant at Engicon, a multidisciplinary engineering consulting firm based in Amman, Jordan. He is involved in several infrastructure projects across the region. Hazem has also served as the founder and board member in a number of other organizations, including a public transportation advocacy group in Jordan and a regional podcasting platform called Salt. He writes regularly about transport and is considered among Jordan's foremost experts on the subject. Hazem holds a Master of Science degree in transportation from MIT and from the class of 2008, and Bachelor of Arts degree from Macalester College 2006. He served as the MIT AAA's vice president from 2011 to 2013, and as president from 2013 to 2016, and since then has been a board advisor for many years. And before I forget to introduce myself, my name is Dana Dabusi. I am a co-chair for this conference, as well as the director of conferences and digital engagement for the MIT Arab Alumni Association. So I know Hazem quite well. I'm very glad that he's on this conference with us as the first time we do it virtually. And without further ado, Hazem, please tell us about your idea.
Thank you very much, Dana, and thank you for the MIT AAA for inviting me to speak. So I have 15 minutes to talk about sustainable urban transportation, and that's a very broad and a very complex topic. So rather than use this short time to focus and talk about a specific area, I have chosen to embrace this complexity and maybe highlight the breadth and the complexity of this issue. And present a conceptual framework which I think is useful for us to think about sustainable urban transportation, and then briefly talk about some examples from my work and from the region. And of course, I'll be talking here about the movement of people in cities, so not the movement of goods, which we just heard about in the sustainable supply chains panel. So just to give some context, and I think this is not new for anyone in the audience, the Arab world is going through a rapid urbanization. Our cities are growing and are sprawling, and there's an increased reliance on private cars. Car ownership is increasing at quite alarming rates in some places. In Jordan, it's about 6 to 7%. And alternatives are not really available. Public transport is weakened, it's unreliable, although there have been in recent years some success stories and examples of positive interventions and large-scale projects in public transport in the region. And the result of this is higher emissions from the transport sector, if we call it. So in Jordan, for example, a fifth of greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to the transport sector. And this rate, actually, not just the absolute value, but the rate itself is increasing year on year. Of course, there are financial and economic implications to this situation. Half of the energy bill in Jordan goes to fuel, and households are increasingly spending more money on transportation, on buying cars, etc. And this problem is not going away. It's in fact getting worse if we don't tackle it. Why? Because the Arab world is known for having a very young population, and this youth is eventually going to grow and get into the workforce and have needs for travel and for moving around and for going to jobs, etc. Women's participation in the workforce is also quite low in the region. In Jordan, it's one of the lowest rates worldwide, actually, unfortunately. So as women's participation increases, also they will have to, have access to transportation, and their demands for moving around will increase. And I think we heard a lot about how transport impact access to jobs and education in the social justice panel earlier from Nermeen. So improving urban transportation is good for everyone. It stimulates economic growth. It provides access to employment, access to economic activities, to education, and so on. And it hits really many of the sustainable development goals, if you want to think along those lines. So because it's something that enables different economic activity across different sectors. We're talking about sustainable development goals on sustainable cities. Even well-being and health, when we talk about urban active mobility and walking and cycling, and so on. And so how do we solve this? How do we address this complex issue of urban transportation? Do we build metros? Do we build more roads? Do we move to electric vehicles? And the answer, I think, is all of the above and much more. And this is why I wanted to highlight the complexity of the issue. And I want to share a few slides here. And in true MIT fashion, I will show you a formula now on the screen. I'm not kidding. Let me just share it. So this is a conceptual framework that I think helped me, and this is something that I learned even from an instructor at MIT, actually, to think about the issue and the different dimensions involved. So if we think about improving urban transportation from a climate change perspective, from the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, then our measure for this improvement is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from transport. And greenhouse gas emissions from transport can be calculated as emissions per vehicle times the number of vehicles. So if this formula would give us the emissions that are resulting from the transport sector, but we can break that down even further. So greenhouse gas per vehicle, so we could say that it's equal to emissions per kilometer. So every kilometer that a vehicle travels, how much does it emit, times how many kilometers does a vehicle travel, times the number of vehicles. So they cancel out and we get the greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector. Or we could break it down even further and look at vehicles per person multiplied by the population. So look at even the number of how many vehicles each person owns, and so on. I'm not going to bore you with formulas, but I've broken it down, as you see on the screen, into these different terms, and I think this is useful for us to think about and to look at the different terms. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions per kilometer of vehicle travel, then and changing that, then we're talking about fuel technologies. We're talking about cleaner fuel, more efficient engines, the shift from internal combustion engines to electric mobility, and there's a lot of work being done there, of course. When we talk about kilometers per person, so how many kilometers does a person need to travel? Then we talk about issues related to physical planning, to urban, regional, neighborhood planning, to providing basic services within a neighborhood within walking distance, to reduce the distance needed to travel. We talk about encouraging active mobility, such as walking and cycling. We also, even beyond physical planning, we even talk about the reduction in the need for travel in the first place for certain instances. So, working remotely, such as, of course, we've seen during COVID, and providing certain services digitally where a person doesn't need to leave their house. So this all contributes to this aspect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transport. Persons per vehicle. So how many people, if you put more people in one vehicle, then you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions potentially. And here we talk about different transport modes and transport services. Carpooling, ride-sharing, ride-hailing apps, public transport, of course, mass transit. And policies that can stimulate that, congestion charges, parking policies that can maybe encourage people to shift from one mode to another or to carpool, etc. And vehicles per person, of course, is where we talk about car ownership. How do we affect car ownership? There's in some places restrictions on car ownership, like in Singapore, I think, and taxes and tariffs and so on. What policies do we need to impact car ownership? So there's a lot of dimensions that can help solve the issue or move us towards a more sustainable urban mobility system. And if we take just the three to the left of the screen and maybe just rename them, so fuel technologies, we're primarily talking about e-mobility and urban planning and public transport. So these are categories of solutions that we can think of in that regard. And even these come with a whole host of other, or require certain enabling elements for them to succeed. So they require the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure. For electric vehicles, we're talking about charging infrastructure. For public transport, the metro tracks, the bus lanes, the buses themselves, the sidewalks, etc. The operations and the technology. This is very important. The infrastructure alone may not help if it's not aided by technology, and technology can really take these solutions to another level in terms of their impact. Governance, institutions, the policies. If I can have as many electric vehicle chargers as I want, but if the electric vehicle charging tariff is very high, then people will not shift to electric cars. Funding, of course, is always an issue, and operating and business models. These are, we're talking here about a variety of solutions, some of which have to be provided by the public sector because they're public services and they are, things that have to be provided, like education and healthcare. But there are other services that may involve the private sector. So how do we involve the private sector in a way that makes really the solution successful? So these in the horizontal dimension are the enabling factors, so to speak. And in each of these rectangles here, we can talk for hours. There's a lot of content. There's a lot of innovation happening. A lot of people working on these different areas. But I think this is a very important framework to to consider when we think about this issue, because we often tend to focus on single solutions or single tracks within this within this framework, and I think we shouldn't. I think solutions have to be have to consider this multidimensional aspect of urban mobility. We can't just say the solution is in electric vehicles, because if I replace all cars with electric vehicles with only one person in each vehicle, then I'm not solving traffic congestion. If I'm talking about moving everything outside the city, which we often hear in Amman, people tell me, why don't we just move all government offices outside Amman? Okay, but that doesn't, that's more travel time, more emissions. So if we talk about this, we're thinking of this framework of reducing emissions, it doesn't solve the problem. If we cut car ownership, it also doesn't solve the problem if we don't provide people with alternatives. So it can be detrimental to human growth, to economic growth. So the solutions have to consider these multiple dimensions, because mobility is a basic human right. Because focusing on, as examples I gave, focusing only on one dimension, can be good in and of itself, but it can be detrimental elsewhere. So if I build more roads and encourage car use, I might be impacting public health by reducing, people's ability to walk around and travel, on foot. At the end of the day, mobility stimulates economic growth. So we need to provide people with multiple viable options for travel, not just, and I underline viable options here, because we're not just talking about providing public transport, but providing public transport as really a true option that people can use. And this is really when we can create a more balanced system or urban transportation system. So I'll spend the few minutes that I have left just to give some examples on some aspects or some of the work that I've been doing or that's happening regionally within this framework. So if we talk about technology in public transport, there's actually a lot of interesting work that's happening worldwide. Data that's coming out of public transport system has been instrumental to planning public transit networks and so on. But also more recently, we've seen innovations in our region. So on your right, you see Swivel. Swivel is a startup that started in Egypt that recently went public. On the left side, you see a new service, relatively new service in Dubai, that's demand responsive buses. So these are new services that are utilizing technology to improve the service that is typically provided by conventional public transport, but adding to it the reliability and the quality and the features that you see in ride-hailing apps like Uber and so on. And these these kinds of applications improve the user experience because the routes are no longer fixed, but they're dynamic based on physically and also in terms of time to better match people's needs. So they are better for the user experience, and they reduce the need for government subsidy at the end. Public transport needs government subsidy, but if you're using technology to reduce the chance of running an empty bus, then you really also benefit financially in that sense. Another example is, if we want to talk about this horizontal enabler, which is technology. When we talk about technology across all of these different solutions, we generally hear, of course, terms like smart cities. And we recently at NGCon have worked on developing the smart city roadmap for Amman. So Amman has just finished its smart city roadmap, where we proposed 10 or 11 potential projects that the city can start implementing. And we also looked at, so we covered the different verticals. You see projects on electric mobility, on walking, on public transport, but we also covered the horizontal because it's essential to have the right governance structure, the right financing in place, the right private sector participation models in place for this roadmap to succeed. So this is something that we recently worked on, funded by USTDA, and GAM, the Greater Amman Municipality, is now taking this forward, to implementation. On electric mobility, there's a lot of work being done. The World Bank is actually doing a lot of work in the region here, and we're involved in a study on unlocking the electric mobility development potential in the MENA region, focusing on Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco. We're part of a consortium of companies. I can't share much because it's still an ongoing study, but the World Bank is doing a lot of work in this regard, and looking at all, even in our study, which focuses on public transport and taxis, on how to electrify public transport and taxis in Jordan. We are looking at everything from the charging infrastructure, the impact on the electric grid, using renewables, to how we can, get the private sector involved, and what sort of governance and regulatory changes we need to really scale up the electrification of public transport and taxis. So these are just a couple of examples. I'm stop sharing my screen, and I just want to, conclude by emphasizing again that urban transportation is complex. It requires, solutions that take into account that complexity and the multiple dimensions. And this really requires a paradigm shift in the way we think about transportation. Typically, we thought only about moving cars and making it easier to move cars by building roads and bridges and tunnels and so on. We need to think about moving people. We need to think about climate change and other issues. It needs a paradigm shift, and it needs, of course, the political will. And there are, positive steps being taken in the MENA. Some countries are ahead of others. We see in the Gulf, ambitious, large-scale public transit projects that are actually being implemented and are now operational, many of them. And other countries, it's more slow-paced. But I think there are, even with the lack of funding, there are different solutions that can be implemented using technology. As so we give an example of technology, for example, that doesn't require much funding or large-scale infrastructure, but can really have an impact. And all of these efforts really have to be, have to move in parallel. We have to move in parallel across the different dimensions. They have to be sustained, and they have to be accelerated in order to really achieve the desired outcome that we need. Thank you very much.